In this video, we are going to be looking at Isaiah chapters 15 and 16, and these are about the burdens or oracles, which are doomsday messages for the kingdom of Moab. Now, I'm showing here what I'm going to be using. I'm going to be using Isaiah Explained, really great website and resource for understanding Isaiah. And I'll probably read mostly from their translation, which has been modernized into our English, the way we speak today, a little bit more. And I'll probably occasionally reference the King James Version as well, so we can get a little bit more insight. Um, and as we use Isaiah's prophecies, I'm going to do a whole series of these. Isaiah really uses a mashup of ancient allegories and history to represent the end times, and the names Isaiah uses, right, in his book are essentially quote unquote code names that refer to future kingdoms and entities. And so it's important to know that not everything in history repeats to a T, but Isaiah uses a composite of many people and events to paint us a picture of what's going to happen. So as such, we can make the comparison of Israel and Egypt that Isaiah talks about, and he uses those as a mashup to describe, for example, the United States. And I will do a separate video on that. For now, you'll have to trust me on that. And so Moab, which these chapters are going to be dealing with, anciently resided to the east of Israel and to the northeast of Egypt, that we are discussing as the United States. And they were kinfolk, like cousins to the Israelites. They were descendants of Lot, who was Abraham's nephew. And they weren't always on the best of terms, right? They had battles with each other. And so this is a comparison, as we look to our times, would suggest that the United States, right, is Israel slash Egypt, and their cousins found to the east, right, would be the English. And so we're going to go verse by verse over the next two chapters, and I think it will become fairly evident of how well this works. A reminder that this is what I have been able to discern from my studies, and you are free to use it or discard it. And I also welcome your insight as you dig into the scriptures so that we can learn from each other. So looking here at verse 1, an oracle concerning Moab. This is going to be a prophetic doomsday message. When in one night Ar is devastated, Moab shall be silenced. When in one night Kir is razed, Moab shall be destroyed. Right? Many scholars believe that Ar was the capital of Moab, and it's located near the Arnon River. Kir, right, is along with Ar, and this was another stronghold for Moab. So when do these things happen? When it says in the night, and both are described as laid waste, both Ar and Kir, and both are brought to silence. Right? When is someone brought to silence? Shock, right? Maybe because there aren't a lot of living people, and so there's a lot of silence. They can't cry out. Verse 2, and they will go up to the sanctuaries and in Dibon to the hill shrines to weep. They will wail in Moab over Nebo and Medeba. Every head shall be bald, every beard cut off. So, and we get in the King James Version, we got Bajith, right? Additional term there, right? Which just means it was the temple, a sanctuary to the false gods of Moab, right? A sanctuary, that's a place of refuge and safety. And so they're going to go to this place, right? Dibon anciently was about 3 miles north of the river Arnon. And so Ar is destroyed, right? people are getting out of the city. They're going to Dibon, which is north, kind of like maybe a suburb to take refuge, right? The high places, places of worship, to weep to their God, right? And shaved heads, cutting the beard off, right? That's what you do when you go into mourning, right? Because of how destructive, right? They've been laid waste. There's nothing left. And they will wear sackcloth openly on the housetops and in the streets, and they will altogether wail and give way to weeping, right? More mourning, they will be devastated by what has happened. Heshbon will cry for help, as will Elieleh. Their appeal shall be heard as far as Jahaz, and they will sound the alarm to summon the armed men of Moab, but their spirit shall be broken. Right? And so we don't really know where Jahaz is from scholars, right? It's being described as it was kind of lost and, recaptured by Moab. And so, this could be some place, maybe if you think about the UK, like maybe Northern Ireland or Wales, somewhere, where it was lost and then re-seized. And these two cities, Heshbon and Elieleh, they will cry over the destruction. It's not really clear if they've suffered destruction as well, but in verse 7 it seems that the English or Moabites, they go north, right, to the kingdom of Ammon, and they reside, Heshbon and Elieleh reside on the border between Moab and Ammon. And Moab will try to rally the troops, right? But the destruction and the devastation is done. Right? There's nothing much left to save, and they are grieving. It's too late. Verse 5, my heart will cry out for Moab. Its fugitives will reach Zoar, and as far as Eglath Shalishashia. In tears they will ascend the slopes of Uhith on the road to Oronaim. They will raise the cry of catastrophe. Right? So Isaiah or the Lord really feels for them, for Moab, right? Their pain at what has been done to them in their great cities. Right? Zoar, anciently was located south of the Dead Sea, where Lot fled for safety from Sodom and Gomorrah. So perhaps maybe a coastal town, right? And says Zoar is in the King James version is, like a heifer of 3 years. I think that really means it's kind of young in comparison to Ar. And Luhith, scholars don't really know with certainty where that is. Verse 6, for the waters of Nimrim shall be desolate, the grass shall dry up, vegetation disappear, and no green foliage shall remain. Right? And so King James Version writes, grass faileth, there is no green thing. So this country has a lot of greenness to it, right? And the greenness is gone, right? If you look at the maps between Moab and the UK, for example, Moab is anything but green. That is not how you would describe Moab here. And so you can start to see how Isaiah uses analogies from the past, but he's not taking them in 100% accuracy. Right? He's using them as a basis to make these prophecies. And so let's go to verse 7 here, right? The surplus they have acquired in their personal belongings they will carry away over the valley of the willows. And so the Moabites take their personal belongings to the brook of the willows. And the footnote, right, in that suggests that this is in between the borders of Moab. Right? And what we see here with the I want to take you over now to some maps here. So we have some key cities. So we have Ar and Kir and Nebo and Medeba, Heshbon and Elealeh. So I have a map here of our current United Kingdom here, or part of it. And so we have London, we have Birmingham, Liverpool, and then across the border, right, of England, we have Glasgow and Edinburgh. We come over here, let's go look at the historical map of Moab from the time of the Bible. Right? And so we get here, we have Ar here, we have the river Arnon, which I think we could compare to the river Thames, and then Nebo and Medeba, and then across the border here, we have Heshbon and Elealeh. And I don't know if this is more than coincidence here, but the orientation of them seemed pretty interesting to me. So you have Nebo and Medeba, right? It's kind of Liverpool and Birmingham, and then Ar or London, is farther down here by the big river, and then Heshbon and Elealeh across the border, which would be two biggest cities in Scotland. Right, and going to verse 8, the cry of calamity shall encompass the land of Moab, the sound of it shall reach Eglaim, and the echo as far as Beerlim. So Beerlim was where a well existed, and in London there's I looked it up, about 20 ancient wells in London, and so people are probably going there for water because of what is described in the next verse. So verse 9, although the waters of Dibon shall flow with blood, yet will I impose more than this upon Dibon, and I will bring lions upon the fugitives of Moab, and on those who remain in the land. And so the waters of Dibon, right, this is thought to be the same place right here, Dimon and Dibon, right? That's thought to just be a play, in alliteration. This is Hebrew poetry, so he uses similar words, but maybe a little bit different because it's poetry. And so the waters of Dimon, right, are described, if it's the place of Dibon, it's located north of the river Arnon, and that's where they would, there's a lot of water there. And so, but the waters are full of blood now, right, because people are dead. And so if we come in here and looking at a close-up of London, right, we have the River Thames here, and then something I didn't know until I looked up, there are actually a whole bunch, and I think by my count there are about 18 reservoirs, of water here north of the River Thames. And so I thought that was interesting as a comparison there. Okay, let's move on to chapter 16. Right, send couriers to those who rule in the earth, from Selah in the desert to the mountain of the daughter of Zion. And so what do we get from this verse? We get that Mount Zion, the New Jerusalem, which is in the wilderness or desert, right, already exists at this point. Selah is in Edom, right, another country that borders on Moab. And what has survived from the destruction of Moab, right? So they have survived, and they send a message, an appeal, out to the nation, right? Isaiah uses mountain, right? But that can also be understood as nation. So they send a message out to the nation where New Jerusalem resides. Verse 2, like fluttering birds forced out of the nests, so are Moab's women at the fords of Arnon. So remember, Arnon is the big river, like the river Thames, and and so maybe they're trying to leave by boat, getting out. Verse 3, provide a solution, they say, judge our case, overshadow us at high noon as though it were night, shelter those dispossessed, betray not the refugees. So Moab says to Israel, right, or England says to the United States, provide a solution, right? So one can only really say that to someone else if you have an alliance or an understanding between these two nations. And so they're saying protect us, right, or overshadow us, right? So they are asking Israel to accept their refugees. Verse 4, let the exiles of Moab dwell with you. Be a refuge to them from the aggressors. When the oppressors are no more and violence has ceased, when tyrants are destroyed from the earth. So the aggressors, if you know the book of Isaiah, is in reference to this Assyrian alliance who are killing many in a world domination strategy. Then in loving kindness shall the throne be set up in the abode of David, and in faithfulness a judge sit on it who will maintain justice and expedite righteousness. So instead of taking the refugees, right, a throne is set up in New Jerusalem, which is the abode of David. And who sits on this throne? It may be Christ at this time, who may now be dwelling with his people, or his end-time servant who personifies Christ as his servant and who fights against the Assyrian. Verse 6, we have heard of the glories of Moab, of its excessive pride and boasting, of its outbursts of false propaganda. Right, we get a little bit of background on who Moab is. They're a renowned, prideful nation. They have many glories, and they have put out lies and propaganda. Verse 7, for this shall the Moabites be made to lament, and all have their cause to bewail Moab, and they shall groan at the ruin of Kir Hareseth in utter dejection. Right? So this is just another way of saying the higher you are on the pride scale, the harder you fail. And they are howling, perhaps because no one is going to help them. Verse 8, for the vineyards of Heshbon shall wither, the ruling nations shall smite Sibmah's vines. Its runner vines reach Jazer, trailing through the desert. Its branches spread abroad across the sea. This is more description about this kingdom, the idea of vines or branches that were previously reaching out past the borders of Moab, even across the sea, is a characteristic of this nation. So this could be colonization around the world or political influence that will end at this time with their destruction. Verse 9, therefore I will mourn as Jazer mourns or let's go verse 10. Oh no, here we go. Let's see. Here, I think we're verse 9 here. Therefore I will mourn as Jazer mourns for the vines of the Shema. I will water you with my tears, O Heshbon and Elealeh, when your shouts of cheers over your summer fruits and harvest are stilled. The joyful festivity will be gone from the orchards. No shouts of delight shall sound in the vineyards. The wine treaders will tread no wine in the presses. The vintage shout will I bring to an end. My breast will vibrate like a harp for Moab, my inmost being for Kir Hareseth. So these verses 9 through 11, just looking, the Lord's expressing, he's mourning about these people of Moab and, and the pastime joys that are no more. Going to verse 12, for when the Moabites weary themselves with petitioning on the hill shrines and enter the sanctuaries to pray, it shall be to no avail. These things Jehovah spoke hitherto about Moab. And so Moab has not been good in the sight of the Lord, and he's not going to answer their prayers. And finally, in verse 14, but now Jehovah has said, within 3 years, as the term of lease, Moab's glory shall become ignominy, which is shame, for all its large populace. There shall be very few left, and those of no account. All right, so when does this happen? For those who will listen to the Lord's end time servant, he will give Moab a 3 years heads up before there is utter destruction, where there will only be a very few amount of survivors left. Right? So as we liken these scriptures to our situation, there is someone right now, is there someone right now who is, as Isaiah chapter 11 has prophesied about this end time servant who is the root of Jesse, who's going to be an ensign to the world, who is or will be given warning about a lying nation from afar that will bring destruction to them. I'm not 100% sure yet, but I do think we are seeing something that may be more than coincidence starting to play out. And that's it for today's video. Thanks for tuning in.